They stormed onto my lawn with fake badges, screaming I was under arrest. But they had no clue I was a federal agent until I pulled out my real FBI badge. And that's when everything exploded. It was a quiet Saturday morning in a neighborhood that prided itself on well-manicured lawns, quiet streets, and a very enthusiastic homeowners association, the kind of place where American flags waved proudly from front porches, retirees trimmed hedges with military precision, and everyone seemed to be smiling a little too wide, like they were holding something back. I had moved in just 2 months earlier, after spending over a decade in the field with the FBI, bouncing between undercover assignments and high-stakes operations that drained the soul and tested every ounce of your judgment. After taking a bullet in the line of duty and being forced into temporary desk work, my supervisor suggested I take time to recover, both physically and mentally, and maybe find some version of peace. So when I found this place tucked between 2 hills with a view that caught the morning light just right, and a backyard big enough to remind me of home, I thought I'd finally made it to solid ground. For the first few weeks, I kept to myself, fixed up the house, waved back when people waved first, and started believing that maybe this normal life thing was possible after all. That was until I met Roger. Roger introduced himself not with a handshake but with a warning. He caught me one morning testing the sprinkler system, crouched over a valve, and shouted from the sidewalk like I was dismantling a bomb. "You're watering outside approved HOA hours," he barked, clipboard in hand, and a badge clipped to his belt that read HOA Enforcement Division, like he'd printed it at home. I stood up, mud on my knees, and told him politely I wasn't watering, just repairing. But Roger didn't like to be contradicted. He scribbled something on his pad and handed me a formal violation notice like he was handing down judgment from a bench. I took it, smiled, and went back to work, but that was the first drop of oil in the water. Roger saw himself as the sheriff of our block, with no official authority, but an inflated ego and an obsession with control. The next week, I found a fluorescent pink note stuck to my garage door, accusing me of vehicle misalignment, and warning me that future violations would not be tolerated. I ignored it, again. But I also started documenting. Years of fieldwork had taught me to always watch the pattern. Roger didn't just enjoy rules, he enjoyed bending them around people's necks. Then came the morning everything changed. I was outside replacing a leaking spigot, my water shut off, tools laid out, sweat dripping down my back in the rising heat, when an unmarked black SUV came roaring down the street and screeched into my driveway. The doors flung open and out stepped Roger and 2 other men I'd never seen before, all wearing matching blue polos with an embroidered HOA badge and carrying utility belts that included zip ties, walkie-talkies, and one guy who had what looked like a repurposed Febreze can with a pepper spray label taped to it. "Step away from the valve," Roger commanded, his voice high with adrenaline, like he actually believed this was his moment of glory. I stood up slowly, my instincts twitching. "You are under arrest for unauthorized water access and tampering with communal infrastructure," he said, lifting his laminated badge like it was gospel. I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Roger, you've officially lost your mind," I said. But that only fired him up more. One of the other guys pulled out a folded sheet of paper and began reading what sounded like HOA code written by a high school drama student. "You are hereby detained under HOA code 134B, he read, "pending review of your violations." I looked at the 3 of them standing there, puffed up, veins bulging, eyes wild with purpose, and I realized they weren't joking anymore. They really believed they could detain me. That's when I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge, my real badge. "You just tried to unlawfully detain a federal agent on his own property," I said, calm and clear. "You need to drop your little toys and walk away right now." The silence was deafening. The man with the Febreze can took a step back. Roger went pale. I pulled out my phone and called the local PD, identifying myself and requesting immediate support. When the real police arrived 10 minutes later, they already knew who I was. I'd worked with some of them on a joint task force years back. Roger and his team were detained on the spot, charged with impersonating law enforcement, unlawful detainment, and trespassing. The HOA president was horrified. Apparently, Roger had never been formally authorized to enforce anything. He had created his own rogue division, complete with a fake website and printed bylaws, and had been using it to terrorize half the neighborhood. One single mom later told me he fined her $50 for decorative flag violations. An elderly veteran down the street admitted Roger threatened to tow his car for having a bumper sticker he didn't like. These weren't harmless HOA annoyances. They were coordinated attempts at dominance. What really shocked me was how many people had felt powerless, cornered, and bullied into silence. That's why I'm telling you this story, because if you've ever been pushed around by someone pretending they're in charge, someone who hides behind fake rules and intimidation tactics, you're not alone, and you do not have to take it. If you're getting something out of this story so far, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell to all so you never miss an episode, because we're just getting started. After Roger's arrest, I thought things would quiet down. But the silence didn't last. A week later, a white envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a grainy photograph of me taken from across the street. Me standing in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee looking out the window. On the back of the photo was a handwritten message in black ink. "You stopped one of us, but we're not done yet." That's when I realized Roger wasn't acting alone. There's something deeper going on in this neighborhood. Something I didn't see coming. And trust me, I've dealt with criminals, cartels, and government-level threats. But what's hiding behind these white picket fences? It might be the most dangerous game I've ever played. Roger wasn't elected to the HOA, he crowned himself. No ballots, no board approval, just a man with a clipboard, a cheap walkie-talkie, and a flashlight strapped to a utility belt like he was gearing up for a hostage negotiation instead of a quiet morning walk. He strutted through our neighborhood each sunrise as if he was the last line of defense between us and chaos, squinting suspiciously at front yards, peering into trash bins, and measuring grass height with a homemade ruler taped to his forearm. The first time he knocked on my door, I assumed it was a friendly neighbor welcoming me to the block. Instead, I opened the door to find him standing there like he was serving a warrant. "You're watering your lawn outside of regulation hours," he said sternly, like he'd just discovered a felony. I raised an eyebrow and calmly explained I was testing for a leak in the irrigation system. Nothing more. But Roger didn't care for facts or logic. He pulled a pad from his back pocket, wrote something down with exaggerated flair, tore the page free, and handed it to me like it was a golden ticket. "Written warning," he announced. "This goes on your record." My record, I laughed, but it didn't matter. Roger turned on his heel and walked away like justice had been served. I let it go. I had dealt with worse. But something about the way he smiled when he thought he had control, it lingered. The next week I found a sticky note plastered to my garage door, bright yellow and impossible to miss, scrawled in thick black ink. "Your vehicle is parked too crooked. You are bringing down the neighborhood standard." The irony of a man carrying knockoff police gear lecturing me about standards wasn't lost on me, but I stayed silent. I've learned that the loudest guy in the room is usually the weakest, and this wasn't a fight worth picking, yet. But I started keeping notes. Not because I was afraid, but because something deep in my gut, something I'd learned after years working as a field agent, told me Roger wasn't just an annoyance. He was the beginning of a pattern. I watched as he harassed the widowed woman down the street for overgrown flower beds. He threatened to report the young couple next door for having a wind chime that he claimed was a sound pollution violation. His language, his posture, the way he weaponized bureaucracy. He was playing the long game, carving out power inch by inch through fear, hoping no one would stand up. Then came the day he tried to fine me $100 for leaving my garbage bin out too long after pickup. It had been there for 2 hours. Barely noticeable, but that didn't matter. He took photos. He sent a fake violation notice in an envelope, with a seal he made himself. That's when I confronted him, calmly, firmly. I told him he had no authority, that the HOA president had never given him enforcement power, and that his actions were starting to cross a line. His smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. "Careful," he whispered. You don't know who you're messing with. And just like that, the mask slipped. This wasn't about regulations. This was about control. And I wasn't going to be his next victim. Still, I chose not to escalate, yet. But Roger didn't stop. He doubled down. He began showing up on my property under the guise of inspections. One morning, I caught him photographing my backyard through a hole in the fence. I warned him once more, this time recording it, documenting everything. Days later, I came home to find my driveway partially blocked by his car and a bright orange sign staked into my lawn, under HOA review, violations pending. It was bold. It was public. It was meant to humiliate me, and I wasn't going to tolerate it. I made calls to the HOA board, but they were mostly retired folks who hadn't attended a real meeting in months. No one wanted to confront Roger. He intimidated them, guilted them, or confused them with enough fake policy speak that they just let him be. So I turned to what I know best, investigation. I pulled public records, looked into his background, traced his HOA involvement, and found something chilling. Roger didn't even own his home. He was renting from a cousin who lived in another state. He wasn't even a voting member of the ED. All this power he wielded, it was a lie, but a well-constructed one. I gathered everything. Photos, fake citations, video of his harassment, statements from neighbors. I planned to bring it all to the next board meeting. That's when things got worse. One evening, I found my mailbox had been torn open, and inside was a single sheet of paper with bold red letters, "Back off." No name, no return address, just a threat. I called the local police to report it, and while they took it seriously, without direct evidence, they couldn't do much. That night, my security cameras caught footage of Roger walking by my house at 2:17 a.m., stopping to look into my front window for nearly a full minute before moving on. I knew then, this wasn't just harassment. This was personal. I decided to act. I sent a copy of the full report I'd compiled to the HOA, the police, and even the local news outlet that ran community stories. I thought shining a light on Roger's behavior would stop him. But the next morning, a brick crashed through my kitchen window with a note attached. "You think a badge makes you safe?" That crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I called in a favor, an old contact from the bureau who worked cyber investigations. We traced Roger's computer activity, connected him to an anonymous message board where he detailed his operations, his targets, and his belief that our neighborhood was the test ground for reclaiming real American values. He wasn't acting alone. He was part of a small but organized group of men calling themselves the Orderly, a collection of self-appointed neighborhood enforcers nationwide who believed HOAs were the last bastion of control in a decaying society. Their methods? Intimidation, impersonation, and control. That night, as I sat reading the printouts of their plans, I realized my fight wasn't just with Roger. It was with something bigger. A mindset. A movement. And I was right in the middle of it. If you're finding this story as unreal as it sounds, and you're feeling that familiar knot in your chest, the one that tightens when justice is threatened and bullies think they can push people around, then go ahead and hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you turn on the bell to all, because this story's not over. Not by a long shot. Because last night, I received a package on my doorstep. No return label, just a plain cardboard box. Inside, wrapped in newspaper, was a brand new flashlight, a walkie-talkie identical to Roger's, and a typed note, "You're promoted. See you soon, Commander." One quiet morning, I was kneeling beside my house, elbow deep in rusted pipes and drenched from head to toe as I replaced a faulty outdoor faucet. A simple homeowner task I'd done a dozen times before. I'd shut off the main water valve to avoid flooding the side yard. My wrench gripped tight, focused on stripping the last stubborn bolt when the sound of tires skidding across my driveway shattered the calm. A black SUV screeched to a halt right behind me, its windows tinted too dark to be legal, and the doors flung open in perfect synchronized choreography, like they'd rehearsed the move in somebody's garage. Out jumped Roger, of course, and two other men I'd never seen before, but they moved like they had something to prove. All three wore dark blue polos with a self-designed HOA Enforcement Division logo stitched over the chest. some embroidered patch meant to mimic law enforcement, and each of them had a belt filled with zip ties, cheap walkie-talkies, and canisters they clearly thought added legitimacy, though I instantly clocked one of them as a repurposed Febreze can, with the label peeled off. "Step away from the valve," Roger barked, chest-puffed, voice shaky with adrenaline. I stood slowly, wiped my hands on a rag, and met his eyes without flinching. "You are under arrest for tampering with community water infrastructure," he announced, like he was reading from a comic book. "This is a felony under HOA Code 134B. I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the absurdity. "There is no HOA Code 134B, I replied, measured and calm. "And you don't have the authority to arrest anyone." That's when the second man, a lanky guy with a forced scowl, stepped forward and pulled out a laminated sheet, reading word for word like a kid in a school play. "You are being detained under the authority of the Homeowners Association for acts detrimental to the water conservation mandate." I nearly laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. Because these men weren't joking. They weren't cosplaying anymore. They believed it. They believed they had real power. They surrounded me, hands twitching near their utility belts, waiting for some kind of resistance. I didn't give them one. Instead, I slowly raised my phone and started recording. Roger flinched. "Turn that off," he shouted. "This is a private HOA operation." I ignored him, kept the camera steady, and said clearly for the video, "You are trespassing. You are impersonating law enforcement. You are threatening a homeowner without cause or authority." That's when the third man, who hadn't spoken yet, took a step closer and hissed, "You think your little camera's gonna save you?" And I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "No, but the FBI will." The color drained from his face. Roger blinked. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but it was already too late. I pulled out my badge, showed it to them, quickly but clearly, and their bravado crumbled in real time. All that faux power they built around themselves shattered. Like cheap glass, they backed away, stumbling over excuses, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a neighborhood training exercise, some nonsense that didn't even deserve a response. I stood still, silent, watching them retreat, their fake enforcement, operation unraveling by the second, but I knew better than to think this would be the end. These weren't men who felt shame. These were men who felt challenged. And that kind of man doesn't back down quietly. That night, I filed a formal report with the local police, handed over the footage, my personal notes, and my badge number, for record. The officers were sympathetic but limited. Without injuries or direct threats caught on tape, all they could do was follow up. So I went a step further. I called in a quiet favor from the Bureau, had someone run names, backgrounds, connections, and what came back was darker than I expected. One of the men, Eddie Granger, had a string of dismissed charges for impersonating officials in another state. Another, the Febreze guy, had posted online in a closed HOA Facebook group about taking back control from lazy homeowners and woke policy weaklings. Their movement wasn't small, and it wasn't random. It was organized. It was rooted in control, in fear, in the fantasy of authority. And Roger? He wasn't a nutcase with a clipboard. He was a recruiter. The next day, every neighbor on my block received a flyer in their mailbox. It was printed on thick cardstock, sealed in envelopes stamped, "Urgent HOA Notice." Inside was a letter condemning me, accusing me of acts of sabotage, threatening HOA officials, and posing a risk to community unity. It called for an emergency vote to expel me from the neighborhood under provisional authority. Some people laughed, others weren't so sure. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't need proof. It just needs a whisper. I held a neighborhood meeting in my backyard, invited everyone personally, laid out the facts. I showed them the footage, the fake citations, the fabricated codes, and when I told them I was a federal agent, not one neighbor left the yard without shaking my hand. Most were horrified they'd ignored the signs. A few were angry that someone like Roger had bullied them into silence. But as I packed up chairs that night, I noticed something strange. An unfamiliar car parked 2 houses down, engine idling, windows tinted. It stayed there for 2 hours after everyone left. No one got in, no one got out, just watched. And when I finally walked toward it, it sped off without headlights. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me. It was bigger than our street, bigger than Roger. And I needed to go deeper. If you've made it this far and your blood's boiling like mine was that day in the dirt, then do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell to all. Because, I promise you, this isn't just some neighborhood drama. This is about how power, when unchecked, festers. It mutates. And it spreads. And we need to shine a light on every corner it hides in. But I'll leave you with this. Yesterday morning, I received a letter in a plain envelope. No name, no return, address. It was typed in the same font as the HOA flyer, just 2 lines. You broke the code. We're activating the neighborhood watch. The scary part? It wasn't signed Roger. Roger had no idea how close he was to crossing a line he couldn't come back from, but I gave him one last chance to stop, to turn around and salvage whatever dignity he had left. I calmly reached into my back pocket, not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to shout, and pulled out my badge. Not a plastic one, not a shiny toy or a laminated fantasy card pulled from some amateur law enforcement starter kit. No, this was a real federal badge, the kind that makes even the boldest idiots freeze mid-stride. I held it up just enough for all 3 of them to see the seal, the weight of it, and said steady and firm, "Gentlemen, you are attempting to impersonate law enforcement and unlawfully detain a federal agent on his own property. I suggest you reconsider your next move." Roger's face turned the color of week-old chalk, and the bravado that had puffed up his chest just seconds ago vanished in an instant. The guy next to him dropped his citation pad, the one he'd clearly made in Microsoft Word and printed at Staples, and physically stepped back, like the air had been sucked out of the confrontation. Is this a joke?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper now. I looked him in the eye, then pulled out my phone and made a call, calm as ever. "This is Special Agent Thomas with the FBI," I said. "I have 3 individuals on my property impersonating officers and attempting to make an unlawful arrest. Please send a patrol car." The silence between that moment and the arrival of the real police felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Roger was pacing, mumbling excuses to himself, while the other 2 looked like they were trying to figure out if fleeing would make things worse. 10 minutes later, 2 cruisers pulled up, sirens silent but lights flashing, and out stepped 2 uniformed officers I knew from previous interagency collaborations. They didn't ask many questions. Once they saw my badge, once they heard the story and saw the uniforms, the zip ties, the laughable utility belts, they stepped in with swift, professional precision. Roger and his crew were read their rights, handcuffed, and placed in the back of the patrol cars. No longer community warriors, just 3 grown men who'd let their delusions fester too far. As they were led away, one of the officers turned to me and said, "You know, this isn't the first time we've heard Roger's name." Turns out Roger had a history. He'd filed multiple fake police reports over the years, all just below the threshold of criminal charges, until now. Digging deeper, the detectives found out he'd tried pulling a similar stunt in 3 other neighborhoods, even got booted from 2 HOAs for abuse of process and unauthorized security actions. This wasn't just a power trip. It was a pattern, a dangerous one. And this time, he'd taken it too far. They searched his home and found a storage bin full of printed violation notices, forged HOA citations, and even a script he'd written to train new recruits in his so-called enforcement division. There was a fake organizational chart, mock ID cards, and uniforms pressed and ready for more people. He had a website too, clean, professional-looking, with fake testimonials and a donation button to support community safety patrols. It was a fully fleshed-out fantasy, designed to prey on fear and ignorance, to intimidate good people into silence while Roger played king of a sandbox no one had asked him to build. The real HOA board, blindsided and embarrassed, held an emergency meeting and issued a public apology within 24 hours. They'd had no idea Roger was operating his rogue outfit. In fact, they thought he was just another overzealous resident who submitted too many complaints. But once they saw the footage and the charges, they released a formal statement denouncing his actions and making it clear that he had zero official standing in the organization. They promised transparency moving forward and even started consulting with local law enforcement to develop actual guidelines for what was and wasn't acceptable HOA behavior. Justice had begun to take root. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There was something in Roger's eyes that morning, just before the cuffs snapped shut, that didn't look like fear or regret. It looked like something deeper, something vengeful. And that kind of resentment doesn't just disappear, it simmers. And if you followed this far, if this story hits a nerve because you've dealt with someone like Roger, someone who abuses whatever scraps of authority they can scrape together just to feel powerful, then I invite you to stand with me. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell to all so you never miss an episode. We're building a community here, one where dignity, truth, and justice actually matter. I've got more stories, some stranger, some darker, but they all have one thing in common. They shine light in places where fear has tried to take root. And believe me, fear thrives in silence. Don't let it. Speak up, share your story, and if you've been bullied by fake authority, know this: you're not alone. But just when I thought things were winding down, just when I thought the chaos had passed, something unexpected happened. 2 days after Roger's arrest, I got a knock at my door. Not aggressive, not loud, just 2 polite taps, followed by silence. I opened it to find a small, nondescript envelope on my porch. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single folded piece of paper with a typed message in all caps. Nice badge, too bad it won't help you next time. No signature, just those words. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, because that wasn't a neighbor. That wasn't Roger. That was someone else. Someone who knew more than they should. And suddenly, the story wasn't about a fake HOA anymore. It was about something deeper, something organized, something still watching. They came one by one, first timidly, then with growing confidence. Neighbors I'd barely exchanged a hello with since moving in, knocking gently on my door, not with warnings or complaints, but with quiet gratitude. An elderly man with watery eyes and trembling hands told me Roger had fined him for improper gutter maintenance, while his wife lay sick in bed. A single mother shared how Roger's fake patrol had taken pictures of her kids' bikes and threatened fines unless they were stored according to community safety protocol, whatever that meant. One teenage boy, barely 15, told me he'd been followed for 3 blocks on his skateboard by one of Roger's so-called officers, berated until he broke down and walked home in shame. Each story was a quiet scar, the kind you carry just under the skin, hoping someone stronger will notice before the damage becomes permanent. And it was in those conversations, standing on my porch, coffee growing cold in my hand, that I realized Roger hadn't just been a nuisance. He was a sickness, a parasite feeding on silence and submission. The twisted genius of his scheme wasn't the fake badges or the costumes. It was how he made good, decent people feel too small to fight back. But now that illusion was gone. With him behind bars and his fantasy of control shattered, the neighborhood began to change, subtly at first. People started waving without that forced, polite smile. Conversations grew longer. Fence lines turned from battlegrounds into shared spaces. A father invited me over for a beer in his garage while we talked about old Chevys. 2 women organized a weekend yard sale for the entire block, something Roger would have considered a zoning disruption. The walls between us, invisible but ever-present, began to dissolve. The real HOA, humiliated by the exposure, didn't waste time. They voted in new leadership, terminated every unofficial enforcement position, and partnered with the local sheriff's office to develop actual guidelines rooted in reality and respect. No more fake squads, no more imaginary codes. Just common sense and accountability. And though I never intended to blow my cover as a federal agent, sometimes circumstances leave you no choice. Because when someone tries to twist authority into a weapon, there's only one proper response. Show them what real justice looks like. Not loud, not angry, just firm, calm, and unstoppable. And in this case, that justice came in the form of a badge I rarely flash, a voice trained to diffuse or dominate when needed, and a decision made deep in my gut not to back down when a bully picked the wrong target. That badge wasn't just for show. It stood for every oath I've taken, every line I've drawn in my career, and every victim I've sworn to protect. Funny thing is, the most satisfying moment wasn't watching the cuffs click around Roger's wrists or seeing the HOA fumble through their apology. No, it was quieter than that. It was kneeling back down at the side of my house, elbow deep in dirt, finally finishing the job I'd started days before. The simple act of fixing a leaky faucet without someone screaming about code violations. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. Peace, dignity, the right to exist in your own home without fear of fake authority. And that's what I want you to take from this. Because I know a lot of you watching have dealt with your own versions of Roger. Maybe it was a supervisor on a power trip. Maybe it was a neighbor who made you feel unsafe on your own street. Maybe it was someone hiding behind policy, procedure, or a phony title to bully you into silence. If that hits home, I'm asking you, right now, to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on that bell to all, because we're not just telling stories here. We're building a community of people who believe in standing up, in pushing back, and in restoring a little sanity and strength where it's been lost. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that justice doesn't always wear a uniform, and sometimes it lives right next door. And yet, just when I thought things were settling down, something strange happened. A man I didn't recognize, mid-40s, clean-cut, sunglasses despite the cloud cover, was parked down the block in a black sedan for 3 mornings in a row. Same time, same spot. Engine idling, no phone, no book, just watching. I approached him on day 3, and as I got within 20 feet, he drove off. No plates on the front, back one smeared with what looked like mud, or maybe deliberate cover-up. Later that evening, I checked my mailbox and found a single photograph. Me standing on my porch, coffee in hand, speaking with the teenage skateboarder. No note, just that picture, taken from across the street with a long lens. And that's when it hit me. Roger's little empire may have collapsed, but someone else had been watching. Someone higher up. Someone who didn't like that I disrupted the chain. Because you see, bullies rarely act alone. There's often a network, a hierarchy, and sometimes those in the shadows are far more dangerous than the ones barking in the light. So if you think the story ends with Roger in cuffs and a neighborhood barbecue, think again. Because what I uncovered next wasn't just about a power-hungry man with a clipboard. It was about a deeper system, one that thrives on silence, and the more I pulled at the threads, the more I realized I wasn't just fixing a neighborhood problem. I was stepping into something far bigger, far darker, and far more dangerous than I ever expected. And if you think Roger was the villain of this story, wait until you meet the man who trained him. And if this story struck a nerve, if you've ever faced someone who abused their power, tried to make you feel small, or crossed a line that should never have been touched, then you already know this isn't just one man's story. It's something deeper, something a lot of us have lived through in one way or another. So if you believe in standing up for what's right, in protecting your dignity, and in fighting back when the truth gets buried under arrogance and lies, I want to personally invite you to be part of this mission. Hit that like button to show you're with us. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to all so you never miss an episode, because what's coming next will blow the lid off everything you thought you knew about power, corruption, and justice in quiet neighborhoods like ours. The fight isn't over, it's just beginning. And I promise you, what happens next, you won't see coming.